Mysticism as a Cognitive Process by Azlan Adnan, M.A. Saturday 20 June 2026. Part 1 Introduction, Mysticism as a Cognitive Process. When we hear the word mysticism, many of us immediately think of religion, spirituality, visions, saints, gurus, monks in caves, Sufi dervishes, or perhaps esoteric knowledge hidden from ordinary people. Popular culture has not helped. Mysticism is often portrayed as something supernatural, irrational, or fundamentally separate from everyday human experience. Today, I would like to propose a different way of looking at mysticism. What if mysticism is not primarily a religious phenomenon? What if mysticism is not even primarily a spiritual phenomenon? What if mysticism is, first and foremost, a cognitive process? What if the mystic is not a magician, not a prophet, not a supernatural intermediary, but rather a human being engaged in a particular mode of thinking? This talk explores that possibility. I am not attempting to prove or disprove any religious doctrine, nor am I attempting to reduce the experiences of mystics to mere neurological events. Instead, I want to examine mysticism from a secular perspective and ask a simpler question. What is the mystic actually doing? Not what they believe, not what religion they belong to, not whether their metaphysics are true or false, but what is the cognitive process taking place? Because if we look closely, we find remarkable similarities across cultures, across religions, and across centuries. The vocabulary changes, the symbols change, the myths change, the rituals change, but the underlying process appears surprisingly consistent. The problem of language. One of the recurring themes in the writings of mystics throughout history is the inadequacy of language. Again and again, mystics tell us that what they experienced cannot be fully described. The Hindu rishi says it. The Buddhist monk says it. The Taoist sage says it. The Sufi says it. The Christian contemplative says it. They all complain about the same thing. Language is not enough. Why? Perhaps because language is a compression algorithm. Language reduces complexity. A single word stands in place of a vast network of associations. When I say tree, I do not transmit every leaf, branch, color, smell, memory, and sensation associated with a tree. I compress all of that into a single symbol. Language is efficient because it throws away information. Mystical experience appears to move in the opposite direction. It is often described as an overwhelming flood of interconnected meaning. The mystic frequently reports receiving an insight all at once rather than sequentially. The experience arrives first. The explanation comes later. And often the explanation feels inadequate. This observation is important because it suggests that mysticism may not be about acquiring new facts. It may instead involve accessing patterns of understanding that exist prior to linguistic formulation. In other words, the experience occurs first. Language arrives afterward. Mind speak and language. During our discussions leading up to this talk, we explored a useful distinction. We might call it the difference between mind speak and language. Mind speak is not an academic term. It is simply a convenient way to describe the raw, pre-linguistic flow of thought. We all experience it. Sometimes we know something before we can explain it. Sometimes we grasp a solution before we can articulate it. Sometimes we sense a pattern before we can describe the pattern. The insight comes first. The words come second. The challenge is that mind speak operates at extraordinary speed. Language is much slower. To use a technological analogy, mindspeak feels as though it operates at exabytes per second, while spoken language feels like a comparatively slow transmission channel. The exact numbers are not important. The metaphor is, a vast amount of information must be compressed before it can be expressed in language. The moment we begin describing an insight, we are already simplifying it. This creates a problem familiar to many mystics. The insight itself is transient. As soon as one attempts to grasp it, translate it, and archive it, part of it disappears. There is a delicate process involved. One must somehow capture the essence of the insight before it evaporates. The mystic's challenge is therefore not merely to discover something. The challenge is to translate it. Mysticism as translation. This leads us to a very different definition of mysticism. Instead of viewing mysticism as supernatural revelation, we might view it as a process of translation. The mystic encounters something that exists outside ordinary conceptual language. Then the mystic attempts to convert that experience into symbols, metaphors, stories, poems, or doctrines. Seen this way, mysticism is less about receiving messages from elsewhere and more about translating experiences that are difficult to express. This helps explain why mystics across cultures often sound similar despite having radically different religious backgrounds. A Sufi may speak of divine love. A Buddhist may speak of enlightenment. A Taoist may speak of harmony with the Tao. A Hindu may speak of Brahman. The vocabulary differs. The cultural framework differs. But perhaps they are all attempting to describe similar cognitive experiences using different symbolic systems. If that is true, then religious language functions much like a map. Maps are useful. Maps help us navigate. But maps are not the territory itself. The words are not the experience. The symbols are not the reality they point toward. The doctrines are not the insight. Mysticism and the unknown. This brings us to what I believe is the central function of mysticism. Mysticism operates at the boundary between the known and the unknown. Science also operates at this boundary. Philosophy operates at this boundary. Art operates at this boundary. But each approaches it differently. Science employs observation, measurement, experimentation, and falsification. Mysticism employs introspection, contemplation, symbolism, and direct experience. Science asks, what can be measured? Mysticism asks, what can be experienced? These are different questions. Neither necessarily invalidates the other. They simply operate with different tools. Science excels at generating public knowledge, knowledge that can be verified by multiple observers. Mysticism excels at exploring private experience, knowledge that is directly available only to the individual. One should not be mistaken for the other. Yet both are attempts to expand the frontier of understanding. Mysticism as an epistemological tool. This leads to the central thesis of this talk. Mysticism can be understood as a cognitive tool that scratches away at the surface of epistemology. It probes the liminal space between the known and the unknown. The mystic is someone who voluntarily enters that uncertain territory. Not necessarily to discover facts. Not necessarily to receive revelations. But to explore the frontier itself. In this sense, mysticism becomes a method of inquiry. An inward method rather than an outward one. The scientist builds a telescope. The mystic develops attention. The scientist investigates external reality. The mystic investigates internal reality. The domains differ, but the impulse is remarkably similar. Both are driven by curiosity. Both seek understanding. Both attempt to bring something from the unknown into the known. The journey ahead. In the remainder of this talk, we will explore how this cognitive process appears throughout history. We will begin with Socrates and the idea that thinking is the soul talking to itself. We will examine René Descartes, Lev Vygotsky, Charles Fernyhough, Edward de Bono, and R.D. Laing. We will look at the rishis of India, Taoist sages of China, Jewish mystics, Christian contemplatives, and the Sufi tradition from Rumi and Al-Ghazali to Hamza Fansuri in the Malay world. Throughout this journey, I ask that we suspend for a moment the question of whether any particular mystical claim is true. Instead, let us ask a different question. What if mysticism is not primarily about belief? What if it is a universal human cognitive process through which we explore the edges of understanding itself? That is the possibility we will explore together today. Part 2: Historical Roots. Socrates, Descartes, and the emergence of inner dialogue. In Part 1, I proposed that mysticism can be understood as a cognitive process, rather than exclusively as a religious phenomenon. I suggested that mystics may be engaged in a particular mode of thinking, one that attempts to bridge the known and the unknown through introspection, symbolism, and direct experience. Before we examine the great mystical traditions themselves, we must first address a more fundamental question. What is thinking? This may seem like an obvious question. We all think. We do it every day. We rely upon thought for everything from crossing the street to solving mathematical problems. Yet for most of human history, surprisingly little attention was paid to the mechanics of thinking itself. Human beings have produced vast libraries on theology, politics, economics, warfare, and ethics. Yet the act of thinking, the process through which all of these domains are explored, remained largely unexamined. The first major figure to provide a useful description was Socrates. Or more precisely, Plato's Socrates. Socrates and the soul talking to itself, one of the most remarkable observations in the history of philosophy, appears almost casually in Plato's dialogues. Socrates describes thinking as the soul talking to itself. At first glance, this sounds simple, almost trivial, yet it may be one of the most profound observations ever made about human consciousness. Consider what Socrates is saying. Thinking is not merely receiving information. Thinking is not merely reacting to stimuli. Thinking is not merely calculation. Thinking is dialogue, a conversation, an internal exchange. When we deliberate, we ask ourselves questions. We answer them. We challenge our own assumptions. We rehearse possible futures. We revisit the past. We imagine alternative outcomes. In other words, we engage in an internal conversation. Today this seems obvious, but in ancient Greece this was an extraordinary insight. Socrates was suggesting that consciousness possesses an inherently dialogical structure. The self is not a single voice. The self is often a conversation among multiple perspectives. When we think carefully, we are simultaneously speaker and listener, questioner and respondent, teacher and student, critic and advocate. This observation becomes especially important when discussing mysticism. Why? Because many mystical traditions begin precisely at the point where this inner dialogue becomes the object of attention. The mystic does not merely think. The mystic begins observing thought itself. The mystic becomes aware of the dialogue, and eventually asks, who is speaking? Who is listening? And who is aware of both? The curious 2,000-year gap. What is perhaps most remarkable is what happened next. Or rather, what did not happen next. For nearly 2,000 years, Socrates' observation remained largely undeveloped. Of course, philosophers discussed reason, logic, ethics, and metaphysics. Theologians discussed the soul. Religious scholars discussed revelation. But very few thinkers systematically investigated inner dialogue itself. Why? There are many possible explanations. One explanation may be cultural. Throughout much of history, talking to oneself carried negative connotations. Even today, many people associate talking to oneself with instability. Children are often told not to talk to themselves. Adults may feel embarrassed if they are caught doing so. The assumption is that talking to oneself signifies abnormality, madness, isolation, psychological disturbance. Yet if Socrates was correct, then talking to oneself is not abnormal at all. It is thinking. What we call thought may simply be internalized conversation. This cultural prejudice may have discouraged serious examination of inner speech for centuries. People experienced it constantly, yet rarely studied it. It became one of those invisible phenomena hiding in plain sight. Everyone did it. Almost nobody analyzed it. Descartes and systematic doubt. The next major step came in the 17th century with the French philosopher René Descartes. Descartes is often remembered for the statement, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The phrase is so famous that it has become almost a cliché. Yet behind it lies a revolutionary method. Descartes was not simply making an observation. He was conducting an experiment. A cognitive experiment. He decided to doubt everything. He doubted his senses. He doubted authority. He doubted tradition. He doubted inherited knowledge. He even doubted whether the external world existed. His goal was to discover whether anything remained absolutely certain after every possible doubt had been applied. And what remained? The fact that doubt itself was occurring. If he was doubting, then there had to be a doubter. If thinking was occurring, there had to be a thinker. Thus, I think, therefore I am. For our purposes, Descartes is important because he shifted attention inward. The source of certainty was no longer external. It was internal. The mind became an object of investigation. The inner world became legitimate philosophical territory. This is a crucial development for understanding mysticism. Many mystical traditions begin with a similar movement inward, not necessarily toward certainty but toward direct experience. Like Descartes, the mystic turns attention inward. Unlike Descartes, the mystic may eventually question the very distinction between observer and observed. But the movement inward remains the same. From theology to psychology, after Descartes, philosophy increasingly focused on consciousness. Thinkers debated perception, knowledge, identity, and reason. Yet, surprisingly, the specific phenomenon of inner speech still remained largely unexplored. The conversation continued to revolve around what people thought. Much less attention was paid to how thought itself unfolded. This gap would persist well into the 20th century. It is remarkable when you think about it. Humanity developed steam engines, electricity, modern medicine, telecommunications, industrial production, yet we still lacked a detailed account of what happens when a person silently talks to themselves. The very process through which these inventions were conceived remained poorly understood. Mysticism and the problem of translation. This historical gap is particularly relevant to mysticism. Mystics frequently report experiences that appear to precede language. They describe sudden insights, states of unity, moments of overwhelming understanding, experiences that seem to arrive fully formed. Only afterward do they attempt to translate them into words. Hamza Fansuri faced this problem. Rumi faced this problem. Meister Eckhart faced this problem. The Upanishadic sages faced this problem. All found themselves reaching for metaphors, poetry, paradox, symbolism. Why? Because the experience arrived before the language. The insight was immediate. The explanation came later. This is exactly the problem we discussed in Part 1. The mystic receives something in what we called mind speak. To communicate it, the mystic must slow it down into language. The process resembles translation. Not translation between Malay and English. Not translation between Arabic and Persian. But translation between two different modes of cognition. One fast. One slow. One holistic. One sequential. One experiential. One linguistic. The hidden importance of inner dialogue. This is why Socrates' observation becomes more important than it first appears. If thinking is indeed the soul talking to itself, then mysticism may involve a refinement of that dialogue. The mystic is not abandoning thought. The mystic is becoming intensely aware of it. The mystic begins observing the conversation, examining its assumptions, listening for patterns, exploring what lies beneath ordinary mental chatter. Many contemplative practices can be understood in this way. Meditation, contemplation, dhikr, self-inquiry. They differ in form, but all involve directing attention toward the processes of consciousness itself. Instead of focusing on the external world, attention turns inward. The mind becomes both observer and observed. Preparing the ground for modern thought. By the beginning of the 20th century, the stage had finally been set. Socrates had identified inner dialogue. Descartes had turned philosophical attention inward. But a full theory of inner speech still did not exist. That would change with the arrival of a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky would argue that inner speech is not merely a philosophical curiosity. It is one of the fundamental mechanisms through which human cognition operates. And from that insight would emerge a new understanding of thinking itself, one that would eventually help us reinterpret mysticism not as supernatural revelation, but as a sophisticated cognitive process. That is where we will continue in Part 3. Part 3. Mysticism in Indian and Chinese traditions. Rishis, Taoist sages, and symbolic language. In Part 2 we examined the emergence of inner dialogue as a philosophical concept. Beginning with Socrates' observation that thinking is the soul talking to itself, and continuing through Descartes' systematic introspection, we saw the gradual recognition that the mind itself could become an object of investigation. Today we turn to traditions that took this inward investigation much further. Long before psychology existed as a formal discipline, long before neuroscience emerged, certain cultures developed systematic methods for exploring consciousness itself. Among the earliest examples are the rishis of India and the sages of China. Traditionally, these figures are described as mystics. Today, however, I would like us to consider another possibility. Perhaps they were also among humanity's earliest cognitive researchers. The rishis of India, explorers of consciousness. The word rishi is often translated as sage or seer. However, these translations can be misleading. A modern audience may hear the word seer and imagine someone predicting the future, but that is not necessarily what the ancient Indians meant. A more useful interpretation might be someone who sees deeply, someone who perceives patterns that are ordinarily overlooked, someone who directs attention inward rather than outward. The rishis were responsible for many of the insights preserved in the Vedas and the Upanishads. What is remarkable is not merely what they concluded. What is remarkable is their methodology. They spent extraordinary amounts of time observing their own consciousness. Today we use telescopes to study galaxies, microscopes to study cells, particle accelerators to study matter. The rishis possessed none of these tools. Their instrument was attention itself. Their laboratory was consciousness. Their subject matter was experience. From a modern perspective, we might say that they were engaged in systematic introspection. They were attempting to understand how consciousness operates. The discovery of the observer. One question appears repeatedly in Indian mystical traditions. Who is aware? This may sound simple, but it becomes surprisingly difficult once examined carefully. Most of our attention is directed toward objects. We see a tree. We hear music. We remember a conversation. We solve a problem. The focus is always on the content of consciousness. The rishis shifted attention away from the content. Instead, they became interested in the observer. Who is experiencing these thoughts? Who is hearing these sounds? Who is aware of awareness itself? This movement is profound because it changes the direction of inquiry. Instead of asking questions about the world, one begins asking questions about the structure of experience. In modern cognitive terms, we might call this metacognition. Thinking about thinking. Awareness of awareness. Observation of observation. The language differs. The process remains recognizable. Why symbolic language became necessary? One difficulty immediately emerged. The experiences being reported did not fit neatly into ordinary language. The rishis therefore turned to metaphor. They spoke of oceans and waves, light and illumination, dreams and awakenings, the self and the universal. These metaphors were not scientific descriptions. They were attempts at translation. Recall our earlier discussion about mind speak. A direct insight may arrive as a holistic understanding. Language, however, is sequential. Words occur one after another. The moment an insight enters language, it loses some of its richness. The rishis were facing exactly this problem. Consequently, their writings often appear poetic. Modern readers sometimes mistake this poetry for obscurity. But perhaps the problem is not the poetry. Perhaps the problem is that the experience itself resists literal description. The metaphor becomes a bridge, a way of translating an internal event into communicable form. Akasha as cognitive metaphor. One concept that emerged from Indian traditions is Akasha. Traditionally translated as ether or space, Akasha has been interpreted in many ways over the centuries. For our purposes, it is not necessary to decide whether Akasha exists as an objective reality. Instead, we can ask a different question. What cognitive function does the concept perform? One possibility is that Akasha serves as a symbolic representation of a deeper informational substrate, a way of speaking about the unseen foundations of experience. Earlier, we discussed the possibility that mystics often describe a realm that appears to underlie ordinary perception. In Indian traditions, Akasha became one way of speaking about that realm. Whether Akasha refers to a metaphysical reality, a psychological experience, or a symbolic construct is ultimately a separate question. What matters for our discussion is that it provides a language for discussing phenomena that seem difficult to articulate through ordinary speech. The concept functions as a cognitive tool. It gives form to something that otherwise remains vague and elusive. Taoism and the wisdom of emptiness. If India explored consciousness through introspection, ancient China explored it through harmony. The great Taoist thinkers, particularly Laozi and Zhuangzi, approached reality from a different angle. Yet they encountered a remarkably similar problem. How do you describe something that exceeds language? The Tao Te Ching begins with one of the most famous statements in world literature. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Notice how similar this is to the complaints of mystics everywhere. Again, we encounter the inadequacy of language. Again, we encounter the distinction between direct experience and verbal description. Again, we encounter the tension between knowing and describing. The Taoists were less interested in defining ultimate reality than in aligning oneself with it. Their emphasis was not on doctrine. It was on attunement. The sage does not conquer reality. The sage harmonizes with it. Emptiness is not nothingness. One of the most misunderstood concepts in both Taoism and later Buddhism is emptiness. To modern ears, emptiness sounds negative. It sounds like absence, a void, nothingness. But that is not how these traditions typically understand it. Instead, emptiness refers to openness, potential, the space within which things arise. Consider a cup. The clay gives the cup its form, but the emptiness inside the cup is what makes it useful. Similarly, Taoist thought often emphasizes the value of what appears absent, the unseen, the unspoken, the silent. This becomes highly relevant to mysticism. Many mystical traditions argue that insight emerges not through the accumulation of more thoughts, but through creating space between thoughts. This idea appears repeatedly across cultures. Deepak Chopra, for example, has described intuition as arising from the space between thoughts. Although expressed in modern language, the underlying idea is ancient. The signal emerges when the noise diminishes. The insight appears when mental clutter subsides. Again, we need not accept the metaphysical explanation to appreciate the cognitive observation. Many people report their best ideas arriving during periods of stillness. The phenomenon itself is familiar. The interpretations vary. All roads lead to Rome. At this point we begin noticing a pattern. The Indian rishi speaks of Brahman. The Taoist speaks of the Tao. Later Buddhists will speak of enlightenment. Sufis will speak of divine union. Christian mystics will speak of communion with God. Different signposts, different languages, different metaphysics. Yet the underlying process appears remarkably similar. Different cultures developed different symbolic languages, different maps, different signposts, but perhaps they were all navigating similar territory. This brings us to an important principle that will recur throughout this presentation. There is an old saying that all roads lead to Rome. Whether or not the saying originated within any mystical tradition is less important than the insight it conveys. Different paths may lead toward a common destination. Different traditions may be describing different aspects of the same underlying process. This does not mean all traditions are identical. Far from it. Their doctrines often differ significantly. Their metaphysics often conflict. Their symbols vary enormously. Yet from a cognitive perspective, they may be engaged in the same fundamental activity. Exploring consciousness. Investigating meaning. Attempting to bring aspects of the unknown into the known. The first great cognitive experimenters. Seen from this perspective, the rishis and Taoist sages become something more than religious figures. They become pioneers in humanity's long investigation of consciousness. Their methods lacked modern controls. Their conclusions cannot be evaluated using contemporary scientific standards. Yet they identified something that modern psychology continues to explore. The mind is capable of observing itself. The observer can become the observed. Consciousness can investigate consciousness. And when it does so deeply enough, it often generates experiences that challenge ordinary language. This insight will become increasingly important as we move into Jewish, Christian, and Islamic mysticism. For despite their profound differences, all of these traditions inherit the same fundamental challenge. How does one communicate an experience that seems to exceed the limits of language? That is where we turn next. In Part 4, we will examine Jewish and Christian mysticism, the emergence of Kabbalah, and the extraordinary efforts of figures such as Meister Eckhart and John of the Cross to articulate the inexpressible. Part 4. Jewish and Christian mysticism. Kabbalah, Meister Eckhart, and the medieval quest for the ineffable. In Part 3, we examined the rishis of India and the Taoist sages of China as early explorers of consciousness. We saw that despite profound differences in culture and language, they faced a common challenge: how to communicate experiences that seem to exceed the capacity of ordinary language. As we move westward into Jewish and Christian traditions, we encounter the same problem again. Different religion, different symbols, different theology, yet the same cognitive challenge. How does one describe what appears beyond description? How does one communicate an experience that arrives before language? How does one bring something from the unknown into the known? These questions lie at the heart of both Jewish and Christian mysticism. Mysticism as a universal human activity. Before discussing specific traditions, we should establish an important principle. When historians discuss mysticism, there is often a tendency to treat each tradition as isolated. Jewish mysticism belongs to Judaism. Christian mysticism belongs to Christianity. Islamic mysticism belongs to Islam. Hindu mysticism belongs to Hinduism. And so forth. From a theological perspective, this may be appropriate. From a cognitive perspective, however, something different becomes visible. The human brain remains essentially the same regardless of culture. A person born in medieval Spain possesses broadly the same cognitive architecture as a person born in ancient India or contemporary Malaysia. The symbolic vocabulary changes. The underlying machinery of consciousness remains remarkably consistent. This suggests an intriguing possibility. Perhaps mysticism is not fundamentally about religion. Perhaps religion provides the vocabulary through which mystical experience is expressed. The experience itself may be more universal. If this is true, then the symbols used by Jewish mystics, Christian mystics, Sufi mystics, Buddhist mystics, and Hindu mystics may be culturally specific attempts to describe similar cognitive phenomena. The maps differ. The terrain may be similar. Jewish mysticism and the emergence of Kabbalah. One of the most sophisticated mystical systems emerged within Judaism. This tradition eventually became known as Kabbalah. Kabbalah developed over centuries, reaching maturity in medieval Spain and southern France. Popular culture often portrays Kabbalah as secret knowledge. While secrecy certainly played a role historically, its deeper significance lies elsewhere. Kabbalah represents an attempt to understand the relationship between finite human consciousness and infinite reality. Notice the recurring pattern. Again, we encounter the boundary between the known and the unknown. Again, we encounter the question of how the finite mind approaches something apparently limitless. Kabbalistic thinkers developed elaborate symbolic systems. They describe layers of reality, levels of consciousness, channels through which the infinite becomes manifest in the finite. To modern readers, these descriptions may appear exotic, but if we temporarily set aside the theological language, we can recognize a familiar cognitive process. The Kabbalists were attempting to map experiences that resisted direct description. Like the rishis before them, they resorted to symbolism, not because they wished to obscure meaning, but because symbolism was often the only available language. Symbolism as cognitive compression. This observation deserves special attention. Modern people sometimes misunderstand mystical symbolism. We often assume symbols are primitive attempts at science. But symbols frequently serve a different purpose. They compress complexity. A symbol can contain multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. Consider a national flag. It is not merely colored cloth. It represents history, identity, sacrifice, memory, geography, and collective aspiration. A simple image carries enormous informational density. Mystical symbols function similarly. They compress experiences that cannot easily be unpacked into ordinary language. This is why mystical traditions often rely on stories, metaphors, diagrams, poetry, and paradox. The symbol becomes a storage device for experiences that exceed literal description. In modern computational language, we might think of symbols as highly efficient compression algorithms. They preserve complexity while remaining communicable. The Christian mystical tradition. Christianity produced some of history's most remarkable mystics. Figures such as Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross devoted their lives to understanding direct spiritual experience. What makes these individuals fascinating is not merely their religious devotion. It is the extraordinary sophistication with which they analyzed consciousness. Many of their writings read almost like phenomenological investigations. They carefully describe subtle shifts in awareness, states of contemplation, moments of silence, experiences of unity, transformations in perception. Again and again they encounter the same obstacle. Language fails. The deeper the experience, the harder it becomes to describe. This theme appears repeatedly across Christian mystical literature. The ultimate reality is said to be ineffable. Beyond words, beyond concepts, beyond description. Meister Eckhart and the problem of naming. Among Christian mystics, Meister Eckhart stands out as particularly relevant to our discussion. Eckhart repeatedly argued that God cannot be adequately described through ordinary concepts. Every name we assign is incomplete. Every description is partial. Every concept falls short. At first glance, this appears theological. But it can also be interpreted cognitively. Suppose an experience exceeds the representational capacity of language. Any attempt to describe it will necessarily distort it. The description becomes a shadow, rather than the thing itself. Eckhart was grappling with this problem centuries before modern cognitive science existed. He recognized a gap between direct experience and symbolic representation. That gap is central to our discussion of mysticism. Negative theology and the limits of language. Christian mysticism developed a fascinating strategy for addressing this problem. It became known as negative theology. Instead of describing ultimate reality positively, mystics described it negatively. They would say, "It is not this. It is not that. It is beyond this concept. Beyond that category. Beyond every definition." At first, this seems strange. Why define something through negation? Because every positive description introduces limitations. Every label narrows meaning. Every concept imposes boundaries. The mystic, therefore, proceeds by removing boundaries. This approach resembles the sculptor who creates a statue, not by adding material but by removing it. Similarly, the mystic removes assumptions, concepts, and categories in the hope that something deeper becomes visible. Again, we see mysticism functioning as a cognitive process. Not as accumulation, but as subtraction. Not adding more thoughts, but clearing space. The space between thoughts. This idea resonates strongly with a theme that has emerged throughout our discussion. Many mystical traditions suggest that insight does not arise from increasing mental activity. Rather, it emerges from reducing interference. The signal becomes clearer when the noise decreases. This perspective appears in Christian contemplation. It appears in Buddhist meditation. It appears in Sufi practice. It appears in Taoism. It appears in modern discussions of intuition. The terminology varies. The principle remains remarkably consistent. Create enough stillness and something unexpected may emerge. Not because a supernatural voice appears, but because cognition itself begins operating differently. Patterns previously hidden become visible. Connections previously unnoticed become apparent. Insights previously inaccessible become available. Why mystics are often misunderstood. This brings us to a recurring social phenomenon. Throughout history, mystics have often been regarded with suspicion. Why? Because they claim to know something that others do not. Or perhaps more accurately, they claim to have experienced something that others have not. The mystic returns from the frontier between the known and the unknown, carrying new insights. Yet those insights often arrive without a shared vocabulary. The mystic struggles to explain. The audience struggles to understand. Misunderstanding becomes almost inevitable. The mystic may then appear irrational, heretical, delusional, mad. This pattern repeats across cultures, not necessarily because the mystic is wrong, nor because the mystic is right, but because the experience itself lies outside the listener's existing framework. The difficulty is communicative, not necessarily pathological. This distinction will become important later when we discuss the work of R.D. Laing and his critique of the tendency to pathologize unusual states of consciousness. The universal problem of translation. At this stage, a broader pattern begins to emerge. The Indian Rishi speaks of Brahman. The Taoist speaks of the Tao. The Kabbalist speaks of divine emanations. The Christian mystic speaks of union with God. Different signposts, different languages, different metaphysics. Yet all appear concerned with a common horizon. Each tradition develops techniques for approaching realities that seem difficult to articulate. Each develops symbolic languages to communicate what lies beyond ordinary experience. This does not mean all traditions are identical. It does not mean all doctrines are equivalent. But it does suggest that they may be grappling with similar cognitive challenges. How does consciousness investigate itself? How does experience become language? How does the unknown become known? These questions become even more prominent as we turn to the Islamic mystical tradition. For in Sufism we find some of the most sophisticated explorations of these questions ever written, culminating not only in figures such as Jalal al-Din Rumi and al-Ghazali, but eventually in the remarkable synthesis produced by Hamza Fansuri in the Malay world. That is where we turn next. In Part 5, we will examine Sufism as both a spiritual tradition and a sophisticated cognitive technology for exploring consciousness itself. Part 5, Sufism. From Rumi to al-Ghazali to Hamza Fansuri, mysticism, cognition, and the problem of perturbation. Having examined Indian, Chinese, Jewish, and Christian mysticism, we now arrive at one of the richest and most sophisticated mystical traditions in human history, Sufism. Sufism is often described as the main mystical tradition in Islam. Sufism is the most organized, widespread mystical tradition in Islam, with orders, teachers, and practices like Dhikr and whirling. There are smaller mystical currents too, like some Shia esoteric traditions and certain philosophical schools, but Sufism is by far the biggest and most recognized. While this description is not incorrect, it is incomplete. From the perspective developed in this presentation, Sufism can also be understood as a centuries-long investigation into consciousness itself. Its practitioners developed methods for examining attention, selfhood, perception, intuition, meaning, and the relationship between language and direct experience. Like the traditions we have already discussed, Sufism repeatedly confronts the same problem. How does one describe experiences that appear to exist beyond language? And how does one communicate those experiences without creating excessive cognitive dissonance in one's audience? This latter question will become particularly important, because throughout history, some mystics have not merely challenged existing beliefs. They have destabilized them. The Sufi quest. At its core, Sufism seeks direct knowledge. Not merely knowledge about reality. Not merely knowledge about God, but direct experience itself. The distinction is important. A person can read 1,000 books about swimming. That is different from entering the water. Likewise, one can memorize theology without undergoing the experiences described by mystics. The Sufis frequently distinguished between intellectual knowledge and experiential knowledge. One knows by description, the other knows by direct encounter. This distinction resembles a distinction we have already explored between language and mind-speak. Language describes. Experience knows. The challenge then becomes translation. How does one convert experience into language? Every major Sufi thinker wrestled with this problem. Rumi and the language of symbolism. Perhaps the most famous Sufi in the world today is Jalal al-Din Rumi. Rumi's poetry continues to be read across cultures, religions, and languages. One reason for its enduring appeal is that Rumi understood something fundamental about cognition. Literal language often fails. Symbolic language can succeed. Rather than attempting to define mystical experience directly, Rumi employed stories, metaphors, parables, poetry, music, dance. The famous whirling dervishes associated with his tradition are not merely performing art. They are engaging in a symbolic enactment of a cognitive principle. Movement becomes meditation. Rhythm becomes concentration. The body becomes part of the thinking process. Modern cognitive science increasingly recognizes that cognition is not confined to the brain alone. The body participates in thought. Attention participates in thought. Emotion participates in thought. Rumi understood this intuitively centuries ago. His poetry, therefore, does not attempt to explain mystical experience. It attempts to evoke it. Al-Ghazali and the limits of rationality. If Rumi represents the poetic dimension of Sufism, then Al-Ghazali represents its philosophical dimension. Al-Ghazali began as a scholar deeply immersed in theology, law, and philosophy. Yet despite his intellectual achievements, he underwent a profound personal crisis. He found that rational knowledge alone was insufficient. Reason could answer many questions, but it could not answer all questions. Eventually, Al-Ghazali turned inward, not because he rejected reason, but because he recognized its limits. This is a crucial distinction. Mysticism is often portrayed as anti-rational. Historically, many mystics were extraordinarily rational people. The issue was never that reason was wrong. The issue was that reason might be incomplete. Science encounters similar limitations. Science is extraordinarily powerful. Yet science itself cannot tell us why beauty moves us, why meaning matters, why consciousness exists, or why there is something rather than nothing. These are not failures of science. They are simply questions that lie beyond its current scope. Similarly, Al-Ghazali concluded that direct experience constituted a legitimate mode of knowing, not superior to reason, not inferior to reason, different from reason. Mansur al-Hallaj and the problem of cognitive dissonance. We now arrive at one of the most important figures for our discussion, Mansur al-Hallaj. Al-Hallaj is remembered for a single phrase, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. The phrase is among the most famous and controversial in the history of mysticism. To understand why, we must first understand what happened cognitively. From a mystical perspective, Al-Hallaj may have been attempting to describe a state in which the ordinary distinction between self and ultimate reality dissolved. The problem was linguistic. The experience may have been subtle. The statement was not. His audience interpreted the declaration literally. Many concluded that he was claiming divinity. The resulting reaction was severe. After years of imprisonment and political controversy, Al-Hallaj was executed in Baghdad in 922 CE. Now let us examine this through the framework developed in this presentation. What happens when a mystic brings something from the unknown into the known? The audience encounters an idea that does not fit its existing framework. The result is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance occurs when new information conflicts with existing beliefs. The greater the conflict, the greater the discomfort. Human beings generally seek stability. We seek coherence. We seek conceptual equilibrium. When a new idea threatens that equilibrium, it creates perturbation within the cognitive system. The audience experiences tension, confusion, resistance, defensiveness, sometimes hostility. Al-Hallaj's statement created precisely such a perturbation. Whether his insight was correct or incorrect is not our concern here. What interests us is the cognitive mechanism. A radically unfamiliar idea entered an established worldview. The resulting cognitive dissonance became socially destabilizing. The perturbation became intolerable, and the social system reacted. Why mystics often speak in symbols. Cases such as Al-Hallaj help explain why many mystical traditions employ secrecy, symbolism, allegory, and metaphor. This is not necessarily because mystics wish to hide knowledge. Rather, they may recognize that direct statements can create excessive perturbation. Symbolism functions as a buffer, a gradual introduction, a cognitive shock absorber. A metaphor allows the listener to approach an unfamiliar idea incrementally. The audience adapts. The cognitive dissonance remains manageable. The perturbation remains within tolerable limits. Seen this way, symbolic language performs a practical cognitive function. It protects both the insight and the audience. This may explain why mystical literature across cultures is often poetic rather than literal. The symbol softens the impact of the idea. Hamza Fansuri and the Malay synthesis. The culmination of our Sufi journey brings us closer to home. To the great Malay mystic and poet Hamza Fansuri. Writing in the 16th century, Hamza Fansuri occupies a unique position in intellectual history. He inherited centuries of Islamic mystical thought. He absorbed influences from earlier Sufi thinkers. He lived within a region that had also been shaped by Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Consequently, his writings represent a remarkable synthesis. Critics later accused him of borrowing concepts from other traditions. Perhaps they were correct. But this criticism may miss the point. If mystical experience exceeds language, then the mystic must search for whatever vocabulary is available. Hamza Fansuri faced the same challenge as every mystic before him. He had an experience. Then he needed words. The available vocabulary came from multiple intellectual traditions. He used those tools because they helped approximate what he was trying to express. The alternative would have been silence. The mystic as translator. This observation leads us toward a broader understanding of mysticism. Perhaps the mystic is fundamentally a translator. The mystic enters regions of experience that have not yet been adequately mapped, then attempts to bring something back. The problem is that the experience itself is often non-verbal. Language comes later. Translation comes later. Interpretation comes later. The mystic therefore stands between two worlds. One world is direct experience. The other is language. The mystic's task is to build a bridge. Sometimes the bridge succeeds. Sometimes it fails. Sometimes it creates understanding. Sometimes it creates cognitive dissonance. Sometimes it creates perturbation. And occasionally, as in the case of Al-Hallaj, the consequences can be severe. Sufism as cognitive technology. Viewed through a secular lens, Sufism can be understood as a sophisticated cognitive technology. Not technology in the modern mechanical sense, but technology in the sense of a systematic methodology. A set of tools. A collection of practices. A disciplined exploration of consciousness. Its techniques, meditation, contemplation, remembrance, poetry, symbolism, music, introspection, are all methods for modifying attention and perception. Whether one accepts the metaphysical conclusions is ultimately secondary. What matters for our purposes is that Sufism developed one of humanity's most refined systems for exploring the relationship between experience, language, and meaning. And in doing so, it revealed a problem that recurs throughout the history of mysticism. How do we bring something from the unknown into the known without creating so much cognitive dissonance that society rejects it? That question will become even more important as we move forward. Because before we can understand mysticism as a cognitive bridge, we must first examine why modern societies have so often confused unusual states of consciousness with pathology. To do that, we turn next to the work of R.D. Laing. Part 6. Mysticism as a Cognitive Bridge. Inner Speech, Mind Speak, R.D. Laing and the Translation of Insight. In the previous sections we examined mysticism across multiple civilizations. We explored the rishis of India, the Taoist sages of China, the Kabbalists of Judaism, the Christian mystics of medieval Europe, and the Sufi tradition culminating for our purposes in Hamza Fansuri. Despite their enormous differences, a common pattern emerged. Each tradition appears to be grappling with the same fundamental problem. How does consciousness access insights that do not initially arrive in linguistic form? And once those insights arrive, how can they be translated into language without losing their essential character? Today, we move from the historical to the psychological. We move from mystics themselves to the cognitive mechanisms that may underlie mystical experience. And to do that, we must begin with a surprisingly simple observation. Human beings talk to themselves. The most neglected fact about human cognition: it is remarkable that one of the most common human experiences received so little systematic attention for so long. Every psychologically healthy person engages in internal dialogue. We talk to ourselves. We rehearse conversations. We argue with ourselves. We imagine scenarios. We review memories. We plan futures. We ask questions. We formulate answers. We generate entire debates inside our own minds. Yet for much of history, this phenomenon remained largely unexamined. As discussed earlier, Socrates, through Plato, observed that thinking appears to be the soul talking to itself. It was a profound observation. But after Socrates, surprisingly little systematic work was done on this phenomenon for almost 2 millennia. Part of the reason may be cultural. In many societies, talking to oneself became associated with madness. A person visibly speaking to himself was often regarded as disturbed. The result may have been an unconscious cultural avoidance of the subject itself. People continued thinking, but they rarely examined thinking. People continued engaging in internal dialogue, but they seldom analyzed the process. The most important cognitive phenomenon in human life became almost invisible, precisely because it was so ordinary. Descartes, doubt and internal observation. When René Descartes began his project of systematic doubt, he unintentionally reopened the investigation. Descartes asked, "What can I know with certainty?" To answer that question, he turned inward. He examined his own thinking. He scrutinized his own awareness. He subjected his assumptions to relentless interrogation. The result was the famous conclusion, "I think, therefore I am." Whether one agrees with Descartes is secondary. What matters here is methodological. He treated his own consciousness as an object of investigation. He became both observer and observed. This methodological shift would later become crucial to both psychology and mysticism. Vygotsky and the internalization of dialogue. The next major leap came with Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky proposed that thought itself emerges from social dialogue. Children first speak with others. Over time, these conversations become internalized. External speech becomes inner speech. Dialogue becomes thought. The revolutionary implication is that thinking is not merely language. It is compressed language, condensed language, internalized conversation. Thought is speech that has undergone radical cognitive compression. This insight becomes extraordinarily relevant when discussing mystical experience, because it suggests that language itself may not be the deepest layer of cognition. Instead, language may already be a translation of something more fundamental. Charles Fernyhough and the multiplicity of mind. Building upon Vygotsky, Charles Fernyhough explored internal dialogue in far greater detail. His work revealed that inner speech is not always a single voice. The mind often contains multiple perspectives, multiple viewpoints, multiple simulations, multiple ongoing conversations. The self is not necessarily a monologue. It may be a dialogue, or even a parliament. At any moment, different parts of the mind may be negotiating with one another. One part proposes, another critique, a third imagines consequences, a fourth recalls previous experiences. The result is a highly dynamic cognitive ecosystem. This becomes important because mystical experiences often appear to emerge from levels of cognition deeper than ordinary internal dialogue. The mystic frequently reports receiving an insight rather than constructing one. The insight appears suddenly, unexpectedly, holistically, as though it arrives fully formed. Mind-speak and the compression problem. This brings us to one of the most important concepts developed during our discussions: the distinction between language and what we have informally called mind-speak. Mind-speak is not a scientific term. It is a conceptual tool, a metaphor, a way of describing cognition before it enters language. When an insight arrives, it often does not arrive as a sentence. It arrives as a pattern, a gestalt. a totality, a structure, an intuition, a knowing. Only afterward does language begin translating the experience. This translation process is costly. Information is lost. Nuance is lost. Complexity is lost. The situation resembles data compression. Imagine attempting to describe an entire symphony using a few sentences. The description may be accurate, but it cannot reproduce the experience. Likewise, language may communicate something about an insight without capturing the insight itself. This may explain why mystics throughout history repeatedly complain about the inadequacy of language. Their complaint is not necessarily mystical. It may be cognitive. Language is simply too low bandwidth to fully express certain forms of experience. The handshake between insight and language. Earlier we discussed what you described as a cognitive handshake. This concept deserves closer examination. Suppose an insight emerges from a level of cognition deeper than ordinary language. The insight exists, but it is not yet communicable. To preserve it, the mind must perform a translation. The insight must be slowed down, encoded, converted into words. This process resembles a handshake between two systems operating at different speeds. One system functions in holistic patterns. The other functions sequentially. One operates simultaneously. The other operates linearly. The difficulty is that the insight may begin fading before the translation is complete. Many people report exactly this experience. A profound realization appears. For a brief moment it feels crystal clear. Then it begins dissolving. The individual struggles to capture it before it disappears. The mystic's notebook. The philosopher's journal. The scientist's laboratory notebook. The poet's scrap of paper. All may serve the same function. Emergency storage. An attempt to preserve an insight before it evaporates. Laying and the pathologization of consciousness. At this point we encounter an important challenge. What happens when an individual reports experiences that differ significantly from those of the surrounding society? Historically, the answer has often been unfortunate. Such individuals have frequently been labeled irrational, delusional, mad, pathological. Yet not every unusual experience is necessarily pathological. This insight was central to the work of Laying. Laying argued that psychiatry sometimes confused difference with disorder. An unusual state of consciousness was not automatically a disease. A transformative experience was not automatically a psychosis. An altered perspective was not automatically a pathology. This does not mean all unusual experiences are healthy. Nor does it mean all mystical claims are true. Rather, Laying's contribution was to insist that the phenomenon be understood before being judged. The experience must be investigated before it is classified. Cognitive dissonance and the reception of mystical insight. Laying's perspective helps us understand a recurring historical pattern. Consider the mystic. The mystic enters the liminal region between the known and the unknown. The mystic returns with a new insight. The insight challenges established assumptions. Immediately, a problem emerges. The audience lacks the experiential framework necessary to understand the insight. The result is cognitive dissonance. The audience experiences tension. The new idea conflicts with established beliefs. The cognitive system seeks equilibrium. One way to restore equilibrium is to reject the idea. Another is to reject the person presenting it. This is where perturbation enters the picture. The mystic introduces a perturbation into the collective cognitive system. Sometimes the perturbation is manageable. Sometimes it is transformative. Sometimes it is intolerable. History contains many examples. Socrates, Al-Hallaj, Galileo, numerous religious reformers, numerous philosophers, numerous scientists. The pattern repeats. The unknown enters the known. The known resists. Eventually, society adapts. And what once appeared outrageous becomes obvious. The mystic, the scientist, and the frontier. This observation suggests an unexpected parallel. The mystic and the scientist may be more similar than commonly assumed. Both operate at the frontier of the unknown. Both seek new knowledge. Both return with claims that challenge existing assumptions. The difference lies primarily in methodology. Science relies on public verification. Mysticism relies upon private experience. Science demands reproducibility. Mysticism emphasizes direct encounter. Yet both participate in the same larger human project: the expansion of the known, the reduction of ignorance, the exploration of reality. One proceeds outward, the other inward. One studies external phenomena, the other studies consciousness itself. Toward a cognitive understanding of mysticism. Seen from this perspective, mysticism ceases to be something exotic. It ceases to be something supernatural. Instead, it becomes recognizable as a particular mode of cognition. An exploratory mode. A frontier mode. A mode concerned with the emergence of novel insights. Whether those insights are ultimately true remains a separate question. Truth always requires scrutiny. Truth always requires examination. Truth always requires challenge. But the process by which novel insights arise is itself worthy of investigation. And that process appears throughout the history of mysticism. The mystic becomes not a magician, not a sorcerer, not necessarily even a religious figure. The mystic becomes a specialist in exploring regions of consciousness that most people rarely visit. This brings us naturally to the next stage of our inquiry. For if mysticism is indeed a mode of cognition, then perhaps its deepest function is epistemological. Perhaps it is one of humanity's oldest tools for probing the boundary between the known and the unknown. That is the subject of Part 7. There we will examine mysticism as a method of scraping away at the liminal frontier of epistemology itself, bringing fragments of the unknown into the known. Part 7. Mysticism as a cognitive bridge, inner speech, symbolic reasoning and the threshold of knowledge. Mysticism can be understood most coherently when it is placed inside a broader account of human cognition, rather than treated as an exception to it. Across the earlier parts of this series, a consistent thread has been emerging. What has historically been called mystical experience often corresponds to identifiable cognitive operations: inner speech, symbolic compression, attentional depth, and pattern integration under conditions of reduced sensory constraint. In this sense, mysticism is not an alternative to thinking, but a particular configuration of thinking under pressure from the unknown. Many traditional accounts describe mystical experience as something supernatural, ineffable, or fundamentally beyond ordinary understanding. Yet a cognitive perspective suggests a different interpretation. Rather than representing a suspension of mental processes, mystical states may reveal those processes in an unusually concentrated form. They expose mechanisms that are normally hidden beneath everyday consciousness. What appears mysterious may not be the abandonment of cognition, but cognition operating under conditions that differ from those of ordinary waking thought. The question therefore shifts. Instead of asking why mystical experiences seem extraordinary, we may ask what cognitive conditions make such experiences possible. This approach does not seek to reduce mysticism to psychology. Rather, it seeks to understand the mental architecture through which mystical experiences become available to human awareness. The cognitive frontier. At the center of this configuration is a bridging function. Mysticism operates as a cognitive bridge between what is already structured in knowledge and what has not yet been structured. It is the mind working at the edge of its own representational capacity, where language begins to strain, and where metaphor becomes more efficient than description. The mystical emerges precisely at this threshold, not because reality becomes different, but because cognition reaches its limit of direct articulation. Human beings constantly encounter phenomena that exceed existing conceptual frameworks. Scientific revolutions, artistic breakthroughs, philosophical insights, and personal transformations all begin with experiences that cannot initially be expressed in established language. Before new concepts emerge, there is often a period of ambiguity in which understanding exists without clear formulation. Mysticism inhabits this territory. The experience is therefore not necessarily irrational. Rather, it may represent a pre-conceptual stage of understanding. The mind senses patterns before it can fully explain them. It recognizes relationships before it possesses the vocabulary required to describe them. mystical language emerges as an attempt to bridge this gap. Inner speech in the architecture of thought. One of the most important historical lines for understanding this bridge begins with inner speech. In the Platonic framing associated with Socrates, thinking is already a kind of internal dialogue, the soul speaking to itself. This becomes more systematically formalized in the epistemic certainty project of René Descartes, where the interiority of thought is treated as the ground of knowledge itself. What both contribute in different registers is the recognition that cognition is not passive reception, but active internal articulation. The significance of this idea cannot be overstated. Human beings do not merely receive information from the world. They continually interpret, organize, and reconstruct it through internal dialogue. Thought is not a mirror reflecting reality. It is an active process of modeling reality. The modern psychological reframing of this arrives with Lev Vygotsky, who places language at the center of cognitive development. Inner speech is no longer merely philosophical introspection but internalized social dialogue, a structure built from external interaction and repurposed for private reasoning. This trajectory is extended further by Charles Fernyhough, who describes inner dialogue as a flexible, multi-voice system rather than a single monologue. Cognition, in this view, is not unitary but distributed within the self. What we experience as a single stream of consciousness may therefore be a dynamic interaction among multiple cognitive perspectives. Different memories, emotional states, conceptual frameworks, and learned social voices participate in an ongoing internal conversation. Mystical experience may arise when this conversation undergoes unusual reorganization, allowing novel patterns of integration to emerge. Symbolic compression and mystical language. When this internal architecture is examined closely, mysticism appears less like an anomaly and more like an intensification of ordinary cognition. The mind, under certain conditions, meditation, isolation, ritual repetition, emotional saturation, begins to prioritize symbolic and associative pathways over linear analytical ones. What emerges is a form of cognition that is compressed, metaphorical, and structurally non-literal. This is where mystical language becomes necessary, not as decoration but as functional representation of states that resist propositional form. Symbols possess a remarkable cognitive advantage. A symbol can contain multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. Unlike a literal statement which seeks precision through specification, a symbol achieves efficiency through compression. A single image, a ladder, a river, a light, a garden, a mountain, can evoke relationships that would otherwise require pages of explanation. This capacity explains why mystical traditions rely so heavily on symbolic language. The symbol functions as a cognitive container. It allows the mind to hold complex patterns of meaning without fully unpacking them into explicit propositions. In this sense, symbolism is not evidence of confusion. It is evidence of cognitive economy. Metaphor performs a similar role. Cognitive linguistics has demonstrated that metaphor is not merely a literary device but a fundamental mechanism of thought. Human beings routinely understand abstract concepts through concrete analogies. Mystics simply extend this tendency into regions where abstraction becomes extreme. Modes of thought and cognitive flexibility. This is also where structured approaches to cognition, such as those proposed by Edward de Bono, become relevant. De Bono's model of shifting cognitive modes shows that human thinking is already plural. The mind is capable of switching between critical, creative, emotional, and generative frames. Mystical cognition can be interpreted as a deep convergence of these modes, where boundaries between analysis, intuition, and imagination become less distinct. Ordinary reasoning often separates these functions. Logic evaluates. Imagination generates. Emotion prioritizes. Intuition synthesizes. Yet, under certain conditions, these domains begin operating in greater coordination. The resulting experience can feel unusually coherent, meaningful, or revelatory. What many traditions call insight may therefore reflect an episode of large-scale cognitive integration. Information previously distributed across different mental systems becomes temporarily unified into a single experiential structure. The individual experiences this integration not merely as an idea but as a lived reality. The neuroscience of the threshold. Contemporary neuroscience offers additional perspectives on these processes. Research into meditation, contemplative prayer, and altered states of consciousness suggests that attention, self-representation, and sensory processing can undergo measurable changes during periods of deep absorption. Certain networks associated with self-referential processing appear to become less dominant, while patterns associated with attentional focus and interregional integration may become more pronounced. Although neuroscience remains far from fully explaining mystical experience, it increasingly demonstrates that such experiences correspond to identifiable shifts in cognitive organization. This does not prove or disprove the metaphysical claims made by mystics. It merely establishes that mystical experiences are genuine mental events with observable correlates. The existence of neural mechanisms does not settle questions about ultimate reality. It only clarifies the cognitive pathways through which human beings encounter what they interpret as ultimate reality. Mysticism across cultures. From this perspective, mysticism is not an epistemic rival to science or philosophy, but a cognitive interface layer. It sits at the boundary where structured knowledge ends and unstructured possibility begins. It is precisely here that symbolic reasoning becomes dominant, because symbols allow partial access to what cannot yet be fully specified. This also explains why mystical accounts across cultures share structural similarities, despite radically different theological frameworks. Whether in Indian rishis, Taoist sages, Christian contemplatives, Jewish Kabbalists, Buddhist meditators, or Sufi poets, the underlying cognitive process remains strikingly consistent. Experiences of unity, transcendence, timelessness, dissolution of ordinary selfhood, ineffability, and heightened meaning appear repeatedly across traditions. Yet the interpretive frameworks vary enormously. A Christian may describe union with God. A Buddhist may describe the dissolution of attachment. A Taoist may describe harmony with the Tao. A Sufi may describe annihilation in the divine beloved. The divergence lies primarily in the symbolic systems used to encode the experience, not necessarily in the underlying cognitive architecture producing it. Reason, intuition, and the expansion of knowledge. One of the enduring misunderstandings surrounding mysticism is the assumption that it stands in opposition to reason. Historically, many influential mystics were also rigorous intellectuals. Meister Eckhart, Ibn Arabi, Al-Ghazali, Shankara, and numerous others combined profound contemplative practice with sophisticated philosophical reflection. The relationship between mysticism and reason is therefore better understood as complementary rather than antagonistic. Reason excels at analysis, distinction, and verification. Mystical cognition excels at synthesis, integration, and exploration of conceptual frontiers. Both are necessary components of human understanding. Scientific discovery itself often begins with intuitions that precede formal proof. The eventual articulation of knowledge requires analytical reasoning, but the initial perception of possibility frequently emerges from less structured cognitive processes. Mysticism occupies a similar domain. It explores patterns before they become concepts and meanings before they become theories. Conclusion: the mind at the edge of articulation. Ultimately, mysticism as a cognitive bridge reveals a profound continuity between everyday thought and so-called transcendent insight. It suggests that what is often labeled mystical is not outside cognition, but at its frontier. It is the point at which the mind, constrained by language yet driven by pattern-seeking, generates meaning at the edge of articulation. Seen in this way, mysticism becomes neither superstition nor supernatural anomaly. It becomes a specialized mode of cognitive engagement with uncertainty, complexity, and the limits of representation. It is the mind attempting to grasp realities that exceed its current conceptual resources. In that sense, mysticism is not a departure from reason, but one of its deepest expressions under conditions where reason must temporarily exceed its own linguistic scaffolding. It is the cognitive bridge between what can already be said and what can only begin to be understood. Part 8. Mysticism as a cognitive interface of epistemic liminality. Beyond the cognitive bridge. If mysticism is a cognitive bridge, then we can push the idea further. It is also an interface operating at the liminal boundary of epistemology itself. That is to say, mysticism does not merely connect two domains of knowledge. It actively works the unstable zone where knowledge formation is still in progress, where categories have not yet stabilized, and where experience exceeds the available vocabulary for its own description. The notion of liminality is crucial here. Derived from the Latin limen, meaning threshold, liminality refers to transitional states that are neither fully one thing nor another. Anthropologists have long used the concept to describe rites of passage, moments in which an individual has left one status but has not yet entered another. A similar principle can be applied to cognition. There are moments when thought itself occupies a threshold condition, suspended between established understanding and emerging comprehension. Mysticism appears precisely within such spaces. It is not merely an unusual experience, but a mode of engagement with the unknown. It operates where certainty dissolves but meaning continues to form. Rather than representing a departure from cognition, mysticism may reveal cognition in one of its most dynamic and creative states. The liminal structure of human knowledge. This liminal zone is not rare. It is structurally present in all cognition, though it remains largely invisible during routine thought. Human beings constantly encounter information that exceeds their existing conceptual frameworks. Most of the time, cognition absorbs these discrepancies quietly through gradual learning and adaptation. Occasionally, however, the discrepancy becomes too large to assimilate easily. Existing categories begin to fail. Familiar distinctions lose their explanatory power. The mind finds itself confronting realities that cannot yet be organized within established structures of meaning. Such moments occur not only in religion or spirituality, but throughout intellectual history. Scientific revolutions emerge when prevailing paradigms can no longer account for observed phenomena. Philosophical breakthroughs arise when inherited concepts prove inadequate. Artistic innovations appear when conventional forms cease to capture lived experience. Mysticism may therefore be understood as one manifestation of a broader cognitive phenomenon, the encounter between existing knowledge and emerging possibilities. It is cognition confronting its own incompleteness. When this occurs, thought enters a liminal state. Knowledge remains active, but its organizing framework becomes unstable. It is precisely this instability that gives mystical experience its distinctive character. Attention, awareness, and conceptual thinning. Moments of deep introspection, sustained attention, emotional intensity, or contemplative practice tend to thin the usual layers of conceptual filtering. What remains is a raw form of awareness in which perception, memory, imagination, and inference begin to overlap. Ordinary cognition relies heavily on categorization. The world is divided into objects, events, identities, and relationships. This process is essential for practical functioning. Without categorization, coherent action would be impossible. Yet categorization also conceals complexity. It transforms continuous experience into manageable conceptual units. Much of what is experienced directly never reaches conscious awareness, because it is filtered through established interpretive structures. Contemplative practices often reduce the dominance of these structures. Meditation, repetitive prayer, chanting, sensory deprivation, prolonged solitude, and intense concentration can alter the balance between perception and conceptualization. The resulting state is frequently described as heightened awareness, but more precisely it may represent reduced conceptual mediation. Experience begins to appear less segmented and more continuous. Boundaries that ordinarily seem obvious become less distinct. The individual encounters not a different reality but a different mode of experiencing reality. Mystical language arises precisely here, as a compensatory system for stabilizing what is otherwise cognitively fluid. Symbolic systems, and the management of the ineffable. Across traditions, this interface is consistently described in symbolic rather than literal terms. In Indian philosophical contexts, the idea of akasha functions as a kind of metaphysical openness, a substrate in which distinctions emerge but are not yet fixed. In Taoist thought, the Tao similarly resists full articulation, pointing instead to a generative process underlying all forms. Within Islamic mysticism, especially in the writings of figures such as Rumi, Ibn Arabi, and Hamza Fansuri, language is stretched deliberately beyond its ordinary referential function. Poetry becomes a vehicle not merely for expression but for cognitive exploration. The metaphor is not ornamental. It is operational. What is important here is not doctrinal content but cognitive structure. Each tradition develops symbolic resources capable of engaging with experiences that exceed straightforward conceptual description. Symbols possess unique cognitive advantages. They can compress multiple dimensions of meaning into a single form. Unlike literal language, which seeks precision through specificity, symbolic language achieves flexibility through layered interpretation. This makes symbols particularly useful in liminal cognitive environments. When categories remain unstable, symbolic forms provide temporary anchors for understanding. They allow cognition to interact with complexity without prematurely reducing it. The function of paradox. This is why mystical discourse so often relies on paradox, negation, and metaphor. These are not ornamental devices. They are functional tools for navigating a domain in which direct description fails. Many mystical traditions repeatedly employ statements that appear logically contradictory. Reality is described as both empty and full. The self is said to disappear, and yet become more complete. Ultimate truth is declared unknowable, while simultaneously being experienced directly. From a conventional perspective, such claims may seem incoherent. From a cognitive perspective, however, they perform a specific function. They prevent premature closure. Paradox disrupts habitual categorization. It forces the mind to remain engaged with complexity, rather than settling for simplistic resolution. In this sense, paradox functions as a cognitive technology designed to preserve ambiguity long enough for new forms of understanding to emerge. Similarly, traditions of negative theology often describe ultimate reality through negation. The divine is said to be neither this nor that. Such formulations are not merely expressions of humility. They acknowledge the limitations of conceptual representation itself. To say it is not this nor that is not evasive. It is structurally accurate to the experience of a mind encountering something that has not yet been discretized into categories. Mysticism and the formation of knowledge. At this point, the relationship between mysticism and knowledge becomes clearer. Mysticism is not opposed to epistemology. It is embedded within it as a generative precursor layer. It is what cognition looks like when it is still forming its own distinctions. Traditional epistemology often focuses on justified belief, evidence, truth, and methods of validation. These concerns remain essential. Yet they generally address knowledge after conceptual structures have already formed. Mysticism directs attention to an earlier stage. It explores the conditions under which new conceptual structures become possible in the first place. Before there is a theory, there is intuition. Before there is a category, there is perception. Before there is a proposition, there is experience. Mysticism occupies this pre-formal phase of cognition. It investigates the frontier at which understanding exists before it acquires stable conceptual form. From this perspective, epistemology is not a finished structure but an ongoing process, and mysticism is one of the ways in which that process becomes self-aware at its edges. Cross-cultural convergence and cognitive architecture. This also reframes the question of universality. The recurrence of similar mystical motifs across cultures does not require assuming a single metaphysical substrate. It can be understood more cautiously as evidence of shared cognitive architecture encountering similar boundary conditions. Human beings possess broadly similar neurological and cognitive capacities. They experience attention, memory, emotion, embodiment, and self-awareness through comparable mechanisms. Consequently, when cognition approaches its representational limits, certain recurring patterns may emerge. Experiences of unity, ineffability, timelessness, interconnectedness, self-transcendence, and expanded awareness appear across diverse traditions. These recurring motifs suggest not necessarily identical metaphysical realities, but analogous cognitive responses to similar epistemic conditions. When representational systems become strained, cognition often shifts toward holistic integration. Distinctions become less salient. Relationships become more prominent. Symbolic thinking intensifies. Narrative structures weaken while experiential immediacy increases. The resulting experiences may be interpreted differently according to cultural context, yet the underlying cognitive dynamics display remarkable consistency. Mysticism and the expansion of conceptual space. Importantly, this does not collapse mysticism into reductionism. Rather, it situates it within a layered model of cognition in which multiple explanatory levels remain valid. A neurological explanation does not eliminate a psychological explanation. A psychological explanation does not eliminate a philosophical interpretation. A philosophical interpretation does not eliminate existential significance. Different explanatory frameworks illuminate different aspects of the same phenomenon. The subjective immediacy of mystical experience remains intact even when its structural conditions become clearer. Understanding how an experience occurs does not necessarily determine what that experience means. Indeed, one of the most significant functions of mysticism may be its capacity to expand conceptual space itself. By confronting cognition with realities that resist immediate categorization, mystical experience encourages the development of new symbolic resources. Entire philosophical traditions have emerged from attempts to articulate initially ineffable experiences. Concepts that now appear familiar often originated as responses to cognitive boundary conditions. Mysticism therefore participates in intellectual evolution. It expands the horizon of possible thought. Mysticism as an epistemic sensing mechanism. From this vantage point, mysticism can be seen as a kind of epistemic sensing mechanism. It detects when existing conceptual frameworks are no longer sufficient and forces a reorganization of symbolic structure. This process resembles adaptive responses found elsewhere in complex systems. When established models fail, new organizational principles become necessary. The system either evolves or stagnates. Human cognition appears capable of a similar response. Faced with conceptual inadequacy, it generates exploratory symbolic structures. These structures initially appear as metaphors, visions, myths, intuitions, or paradoxes. Over time, some of these structures become refined into philosophical systems, scientific theories, artistic movements, or theological doctrines. The process begins not with certainty, but with ambiguity. Mysticism therefore occupies a unique position within cognitive development. It functions as an exploratory mechanism operating beyond the boundaries of established representation. From intuition to formal knowledge, this helps explain why mysticism often appears ahead of formal knowledge systems. It occupies the pre-theoretical space where intuition and symbolic compression outpace analytic formalization. Many intellectual breakthroughs begin as vague intuitions. The insight arrives before the explanation. A pattern is recognized before it can be justified. A possibility is sensed before it can be demonstrated. Only later does formal reasoning stabilize these intuitions into systematic knowledge. The history of ideas repeatedly demonstrates this progression. Exploratory imagination often precedes rigorous analysis. Vision comes before verification. Mysticism inhabits this initial phase. It does not replace analytical reasoning. Rather, it provides raw material from which later forms of structured knowledge may emerge. The movement is therefore not simply from ignorance to knowledge. It is a transformation from unstructured awareness to progressively stabilized representation. Thinking at the edge of the known. Seen in this way, mysticism is not a marginal phenomenon. It is a structural feature of cognition operating at the threshold where epistemology is still under construction. It marks the point where the mind encounters the limits of its own categories and, in response, generates new symbolic pathways to continue thinking beyond them. Mysticism is therefore neither the abandonment of reason nor the rejection of knowledge. It is the exploration of the conditions under which new knowledge becomes possible. It occupies the frontier between what can already be understood and what is only beginning to emerge. At this frontier, language becomes symbolic, concepts become fluid, and certainty gives way to exploration. Yet cognition does not cease. It adapts. It reorganizes. It experiments with new forms of representation. Mysticism, understood in this way, is the cognitive interface of epistemic liminality. It is the mind becoming aware of its own boundaries and simultaneously discovering the means to move beyond them. In doing so, it reveals not the end of knowledge, but the continual process through which knowledge renews itself at the edges of the unknown. Part 9. Pantheism and Panentheism, Cognitive Interpretations of Mystical Experience. From experience to interpretation. When mystical cognition is translated into metaphysical language, it tends to stabilize into interpretive frameworks that attempt to account for the felt sense of unity, depth, or totality reported in contemplative states. Two of the most persistent frameworks in this regard are pantheism and panentheism. These are not empirical claims in the strict sense, but conceptual models, attempts to map the structure of experience onto a theory of reality. Pantheism asserts, in its simplest form, that reality and divinity are identical. Everything that exists is, in some sense, divine. Panentheism, by contrast, proposes a more layered model. The divine encompasses the universe but is not exhausted by it. The world is within the divine, but the divine exceeds the world. On the surface, this is a theological distinction. At a deeper level, it can also be read as a difference in how human cognition structures totalizing experience. The purpose of this chapter is not to determine which of these frameworks is ultimately correct. Such a determination would lie beyond the scope of cognitive inquiry. Rather, the aim is to examine why these particular frameworks arise so frequently in response to mystical experience, and what this reveals about the relationship between cognition, symbolism, and metaphysical interpretation. Mystical experience and the search for ontology. Mystical states often carry a strong phenomenological feature, a collapse of ordinary subject-object distinction. The sense of separation between observer and observed becomes attenuated, and experience appears unified, interconnected, and profoundly meaningful. Time may seem suspended. Boundaries between self and world may soften or disappear altogether. The resulting experience is frequently accompanied by a conviction that one has encountered a deeper level of reality. Yet experience alone does not automatically produce doctrine. Once the experience subsides, cognition begins the task of interpretation. The mind seeks concepts, categories, and explanatory structures capable of making sense of what has occurred. This search for explanation is unavoidable. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. Experiences that challenge existing conceptual frameworks generate cognitive pressure. The mind responds by constructing narratives and models that restore coherence. When confronted with experiences of radical unity, two broad metaphysical possibilities often emerge. The first interprets unity as identity. The second interprets unity as participation within a greater whole. These become, respectively, the foundations of pantheistic and panentheistic thought. Mysticism and metaphysics, similarities and differences. The distinction between mysticism and metaphysics is often blurred, because both concern questions of ultimate reality. As a result, the terms are frequently treated as interchangeable. Yet from a cognitive perspective, they refer to fundamentally different phenomena operating at different stages of the knowledge-forming process. Mysticism begins with experience. It concerns states of consciousness characterized by altered perception, intensified awareness, symbolic insight, feelings of unity, dissolution of ordinary boundaries, or encounters with what appears to be a deeper level of reality. Whether these experiences occur through meditation, prayer, contemplation, ritual practice, or spontaneous insight, they are primarily phenomenological. They are events within consciousness. Metaphysics, by contrast, begins with interpretation. It concerns the conceptual frameworks constructed to explain the nature of reality. Questions such as whether God exists, whether reality is fundamentally mental or material, whether the universe possesses an ultimate ground, or whether consciousness is primary are metaphysical questions. They are not experiences themselves, but theories about what experiences might mean. The relationship between the two can be understood through a simple analogy. Mysticism is the observation, metaphysics is the explanatory model. Mysticism provides the raw phenomenological data, while metaphysics attempts to organize that data into a coherent account of reality. This distinction becomes particularly important when viewed through the lens of cognition. A mystical experience may be relatively similar across different cultures, yet the metaphysical conclusions drawn from it can differ dramatically. One individual may interpret an experience of unity as evidence for pantheism. Another may interpret the same experience as support for panentheism. A Buddhist may understand it in terms of emptiness and interdependence, while a Christian contemplative may understand it as communion with God. The variation lies not necessarily in the experience itself, but in the interpretive structures applied to it. Cultural traditions, language, education, symbolic systems, and prior beliefs all influence how a mystical experience becomes translated into metaphysical doctrine. This suggests that mysticism and metaphysics occupy different levels of cognitive organization. Mysticism belongs primarily to the experiential level, where awareness encounters patterns that have not yet been fully conceptualized. Metaphysics belongs to the interpretive level, where cognition attempts to stabilize those patterns within a systematic worldview. Seen in this way, metaphysics may be understood as a secondary product of mystical cognition rather than its source. The experience comes first, the explanatory framework follows. Mysticism generates the cognitive pressure. Metaphysics provides one possible resolution. Recognizing this distinction helps prevent a common error. It allows us to examine mystical experience without prematurely committing ourselves to any particular metaphysical doctrine. The experience can be studied as a cognitive phenomenon even while questions concerning ultimate reality remain open. Pantheism as the metaphysics of identity. Pantheism offers one of the most direct interpretations of mystical unity. If the boundaries between self and world dissolve, and if all distinctions appear to collapse into a single interconnected reality, then one possible conclusion is that all things are fundamentally identical at their deepest level. Historically, pantheistic tendencies have appeared in many traditions. Certain interpretations of Advaita Vedanta approach this position through the identification of Atman and Brahman. Elements of Stoicism display a similar intuition. The philosophy of Baruch Spinoza provides perhaps the most systematic articulation in the Western tradition, presenting reality as a single infinite substance of which all things are modes or expressions. From a cognitive perspective, pantheism can be understood as a stabilization strategy. It resolves the tension created by experiences of unity by reducing multiplicity to a deeper identity. Diversity becomes appearance. Unity becomes reality. The appeal of this framework is obvious. It provides a simple and elegant explanation for experiences in which distinctions appear secondary to underlying interconnectedness. If everything is ultimately one, then experiences of unity are interpreted as direct perceptions of reality, rather than temporary alterations of consciousness. At the same time, pantheism raises important philosophical questions. If all distinctions are ultimately illusory, how do individuality, agency, and difference emerge? How should one account for the apparent multiplicity of experience? These questions reveal that even the most comprehensive metaphysical systems remain interpretive constructions rather than final solutions. Panentheism as the metaphysics of inclusion. Panentheism begins from a similar experiential foundation but arrives at a different conclusion. Rather than identifying reality and divinity completely, it proposes that reality exists within a greater divine context that exceeds it. In this framework, unity does not require identity. Distinctions remain real, yet they are contained within a larger encompassing whole. The universe participates in the divine without exhausting it. This model has appeared in various forms throughout intellectual history. Elements of Neoplatonism, Christian mysticism, Jewish mystical thought, Sufi metaphysics, and modern process theology all exhibit panentheistic tendencies. The recurring intuition is that ultimate reality is simultaneously immanent and transcendent, present within the world yet exceeding the world. Cognitively, panentheism resolves the same tension as pantheism but through a different strategy. Instead of eliminating difference, it preserves difference within a higher-order unity. Diversity remains meaningful, while interconnectedness remains fundamental. This allows panentheism to accommodate both mystical experiences of unity and ordinary experiences of individuality. It offers a more layered ontology, one capable of integrating transcendence and immanence, without reducing one to the other. The cognitive necessity of metaphysical frameworks. Neither pantheism nor panentheism can be decisively verified through empirical methods alone, because both arise from the translation of subjective cognitive states into metaphysical language. What can be examined more precisely, however, is the cognitive necessity that produces such frameworks. The mind does not tolerate ambiguity indefinitely. Experiences of boundary dissolution create conceptual instability. The categories through which reality is ordinarily organized become insufficient. In response, cognition seeks new organizing principles. Pantheism and panentheism can therefore be understood as post-experiential compression models. They are attempts to stabilize what is otherwise an unstable phenomenological field. Pantheism compresses difference into identity. Panentheism preserves difference within a larger unity. Each resolves the same cognitive tension in a different direction. One does so through radical equivalence. The other through hierarchical inclusion. Seen from this perspective, the divergence between these frameworks is less a disagreement about external reality than a reflection of different cognitive strategies for organizing experiences of profound unity. Mystical traditions and interpretive pluralism. Historically, mystical traditions have oscillated between these interpretive poles. Certain readings of Spinoza are frequently interpreted as pantheistic. Meister Eckhart sometimes appears to move in a similar direction, though his thought resists simple categorization. Many strands of Christian mysticism, particularly those influenced by negative theology, incline toward panentheistic formulations. Within Sufism, the situation is especially interesting. Expressions of divine unity often coexist with emphatic assertions of divine transcendence. The writings of Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and Hamza Fansuri reveal an ongoing tension between identity and transcendence, immanence and otherness. What this suggests is not doctrinal inconsistency but cognitive pluralism. Mystical cognition does not produce a single metaphysical output. Instead, it generates a field of interpretive possibilities, each attempting to account for the same underlying experiential structure. The diversity of mystical doctrines may therefore reflect the flexibility of human cognition rather than the existence of fundamentally different experiences. The provisional nature of metaphysical conclusions. From a cognitive perspective, both pantheism and panentheism are higher-order symbolic stabilizations. They take a transient, non-propositional experience and convert it into a structured worldview. This process is necessary if mystical insight is to be communicated, transmitted, debated, or integrated into broader systems of thought. Without such stabilization, mystical experiences would remain private events with little cultural or intellectual impact. Yet the resulting framework should not be mistaken for the experiences themselves. Every metaphysical model involves abstraction, simplification, and conceptual reconstruction. The map is not the territory. For this reason, both pantheism and panentheism remain provisional. They do not exhaust the phenomenon they attempt to describe. They are interpretive endpoints of a deeper cognitive process that precedes metaphysical commitment. Seen in this way, they function less as final answers than as directional markers, ways of orienting thought after encountering the limits of ordinary epistemic structure. From interpretation to speculation, seen within the broader arc of this book, the distinction between pantheism and panentheism reinforces a central claim. Mystical experience is not primarily a source of doctrinal knowledge, but a generator of interpretive structures. It produces cognitive pressure at the boundaries of representation, and metaphysics emerges as one of the ways in which that pressure is resolved. Pantheism and panentheism, therefore, need not be understood as competing truths about reality. Rather, they can be viewed as alternative cognitive strategies for organizing experiences of unity that exceed ordinary conceptual categories. One resolves the tension by identifying reality and divinity as one. The other resolves it by preserving transcendence within a larger encompassing whole. Both are intelligible responses to the same phenomenological challenge. Importantly, neither framework can claim final epistemic authority. Both remain provisional attempts to stabilize experiences that arise at the frontier of cognition. They function less as conclusions than as orienting hypotheses, maps drawn from encounters with territory that remains only partially explored. This recognition invites a more cautious intellectual posture. If mystical cognition generates multiple plausible metaphysical interpretations, then the question is no longer which interpretation must be true, but how human beings should think when confronted with possibilities that cannot yet be decisively confirmed or falsified. At this point, we arrive at the final stage of the inquiry. Having examined the cognitive origins of mystical experience, the symbolic structures through which it is expressed, and the metaphysical frameworks into which it often crystallizes, we must now ask what comes after interpretation itself. How should cognition proceed at the edge of uncertainty? What role do postulates, hypotheses, synchronistic patterns, and speculative models play in the expansion of knowledge? Can ideas that begin as intuitions eventually become subjects of systematic investigation? And how do we distinguish productive speculation from mere fantasy? These questions lead naturally into the final part of this book, where the focus shifts from established interpretations toward the future horizon of cognitive discovery. There we will explore the role of postulates, the importance of falsification, and the possibility that some of today's mystical intuitions may become tomorrow's testable ideas. Part 10: Postulates, Synchrony, and the Future of Cognitive Discovery. Beyond interpretation. If we accept the framework developed across this book, that mystical experience can be understood as a structured cognitive process operating at the limits of representation, then the final step is to consider what follows from it. Not in terms of closure, but in terms of forward extension. The question is not whether mysticism yields final answers, but whether it can function as a disciplined generator of hypotheses about cognition, perception, and discovery itself. Throughout this book, the central argument has been that mystical experience is not an anomaly existing outside ordinary cognition. Rather, it represents a particular mode of cognition operating under conditions in which existing conceptual structures become strained or temporarily insufficient. What appears mysterious is often cognition encountering its own limits and attempting to move beyond them. The implications of this argument extend beyond the study of mysticism. If cognition possesses mechanisms capable of operating at the frontier of representation, then these mechanisms may have significance not only for spirituality but also for creativity, innovation, scientific discovery, and the future evolution of knowledge itself. Experience, interpretation, and postulate. At this stage, it becomes useful to distinguish between three layers: experience, interpretation, and postulate. Experience refers to the raw phenomenological event. It is what occurs before explanation. A feeling of unity, a sudden insight, a powerful intuition, or an altered state of awareness belongs to this level. Interpretation is the symbolic system imposed upon the experience. Here the individual draws upon language, culture, religion, philosophy, and personal belief to explain what has occurred. Mystical experiences become translated into narratives of enlightenment, divine encounter, cosmic unity, or transcendence. Postulate occupies a unique position between interpretation and formal science. A postulate is neither a purely subjective experience nor a fully established theory. It is a structured speculative proposition motivated by observation but not yet verified through systematic investigation. This distinction is important because much confusion arises when these levels are conflated. Experiences are often mistaken for evidence. Interpretations are often mistaken for facts. Postulates are often mistaken for conclusions. A mature epistemology requires keeping these layers distinct while recognizing their relationship. Experience generates questions. Interpretation generates meaning. Postulates generates avenues for investigation. The role of speculation in human knowledge. Speculation has acquired an unfortunate reputation in many intellectual circles because it is frequently associated with unfounded claims. Yet without speculation, no new field of inquiry can emerge. Every major scientific revolution began as a speculative possibility. The heliocentric model, the existence of atoms, continental drift, relativity, quantum mechanics, and natural selection all began as ideas that exceeded the available evidence of their time. The crucial distinction is not between speculation and non-speculation. The crucial distinction is between disciplined speculation and undisciplined speculation. Disciplined speculation remains aware of its provisional status. It recognizes uncertainty. It invites testing. It accepts the possibility of failure. Undisciplined speculation converts possibility into certainty before justification exists. Mysticism has historically generated both forms. It has inspired profound philosophical inquiry, but it has also encouraged dogmatic certainty. The challenge is therefore not to eliminate speculation but to place it within an epistemological framework capable of self-correction. Synchrony and the mystery of simultaneous discovery. One of the most intriguing directions in this space is the phenomenon of synchrony in discovery. Across the history of science and mathematics, we observe repeated instances of multiple independent invention, similar ideas emerging in different places at roughly the same time. The development of calculus by Newton and Leibniz remains the most famous example. Similar patterns can be observed in evolutionary theory, technological innovation, and numerous scientific breakthroughs. The conventional explanation appeals to shared intellectual environments, accumulated knowledge, and convergent problem-solving pressures. This explanation is persuasive and often sufficient. Human beings confronting similar problems with similar cognitive tools frequently arrive at similar solutions. From a cognitive standpoint, synchrony can therefore be framed as the convergence of distributed problem-solving systems operating under comparable constraints. Minds embedded within similar informational ecosystems tend to produce analogous outputs when they encounter similar epistemic bottlenecks. In this sense, multiple discovery is not anomalous but expected. It reflects the structural regularities of cognition itself. Yet the phenomenon continues to invite reflection because of its subjective dimension. Participants often describe discoveries not as gradual constructions, but as sudden arrivals. The insight appears unexpectedly, fully formed, as though emerging from somewhere beyond ordinary reasoning. The phenomenology of insight. This experiential texture deserves attention. Many thinkers, artists, scientists, and mystics report moments of abrupt clarity. A solution appears after prolonged uncertainty. A pattern suddenly becomes visible. A previously intractable problem reorganizes itself into coherence. Psychologically, such moments can often be explained through unconscious processing. The mind continues working on problems outside conscious awareness until a threshold of integration is reached. Nevertheless, the subjective experience remains striking. Insight frequently feels discovered rather than manufactured. Historically, this has given rise to interpretations involving inspiration, revelation, divine guidance, collective consciousness, or other forms of transpersonal influence. The cognitive approach neither accepts nor dismisses these interpretations automatically. Instead, it asks a different question: what kinds of processes generate the experience of sudden knowing? That question remains open and continues to provide fertile ground for investigation. Boundary hypotheses and cognitive exploration. It is within this interpretive space that speculative postulates occasionally arise. One such postulate is the possibility that subtle environmental factors might influence cognition in ways not yet fully understood. These could include electromagnetic fluctuations, geophysical variables, atmospheric conditions, or other environmental influences whose effects may be extremely weak yet potentially measurable. A reflective thinker might even wonder whether phenomena such as solar activity, geomagnetic variation, or particle interactions could correlate with cognitive states under particular circumstances. Such possibilities remain highly speculative. They should not be confused with established science. Yet their value lies not necessarily in their correctness but in their capacity to generate testable questions. A boundary hypothesis functions as an intellectual probe extending beyond current knowledge. Most such probes will fail. Some may reveal unexpected relationships. The history of science suggests that both outcomes are valuable. The discipline of falsification. Importantly, speculative postulates only become intellectually meaningful when subjected to the discipline of falsification. The philosophical framework associated with Karl Popper remains relevant here. A proposition gains scientific significance not because it sounds plausible, but because it can, in principle, be proven wrong. The willingness to expose an idea to potential failure is what separates inquiry from dogma. A claim concerning environmental influences on cognition would therefore require clear definitions, measurable variables, predictive power, and conditions under which it could be rejected. Without these elements, speculation remains philosophy or imagination. With them, speculation becomes science in its earliest developmental stage. This principle applies equally to mystical claims. The fact that an experience feels profound does not guarantee that its interpretation is correct. Cognitive humility requires distinguishing certainty of experience from certainty of explanation. Mysticism and cognitive evolution. This brings us to a broader point about the role of mysticism in cognitive evolution. If mysticism is understood as the mind operating at the boundary of its representational capacity, then speculative postulation becomes one of its downstream expressions in disciplined form. Mysticism generates novel patterns. Symbolic systems organize those patterns. Postulates transform them into questions. Science attempts to answer those questions. Viewed in this way, these domains are not necessarily antagonistic. They represent different stages within a larger process of knowledge formation. Mysticism occupies the exploratory frontier. Philosophy organizes possibilities. Science evaluates them. The boundaries between these activities are real, but they are also permeable. Throughout history, ideas have frequently migrated from one domain to another. What begins as intuition may eventually become hypothesis. What begins as hypothesis may eventually become established knowledge. An integrated model of discovery. The future of cognitive discovery may therefore lie in a careful integration of three modes: phenomenological attentiveness, symbolic interpretation, and formal constraint. Phenomenology provides access to lived cognitive events. Symbolic systems allow those events to be communicated, compared, and culturally preserved. Formal methods ensure that speculation remains tethered to evidence and remains vulnerable to correction. Each mode compensates for the limitations of the others. Experience without interpretation remains private. Interpretation without testing becomes dogma. Testing without imagination risks stagnation. A mature cognitive framework requires all three. Mysticism as data. Within such a framework, mysticism is no longer a marginal curiosity or a purely theological category. It becomes a potential source of data concerning the operation of human cognition under unusual conditions. This does not mean that mystical interpretations should be accepted uncritically, nor does it mean they should be dismissed automatically. Rather, mystical reports can be examined as structured cognitive outputs generated under specific psychological and phenomenological conditions. The experiences themselves become objects of study. Their interpretations become hypotheses. Their recurring patterns become data. This approach preserves intellectual rigor without sacrificing intellectual curiosity. Conclusion: mysticism as a cognitive process. The argument developed throughout this book has been both simple and ambitious. Mysticism is not best understood as a supernatural exception to cognition, nor is it best understood as mere illusion, pathology, or irrationality. Instead, it can be understood as a cognitive process. From the inner dialogues described by Socrates and Descartes, through the symbolic traditions of India, China, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to the psychological insights of R.D. Laing and contemporary theories of inner speech, a consistent theme emerges. Human cognition possesses the capacity to operate beyond ordinary conceptual boundaries. When it does so, it generates experiences that are often symbolic, unitive, paradoxical, and difficult to articulate. These experiences become stabilized through language, myth, theology, philosophy, and metaphysics. They generate interpretive frameworks such as pantheism and panentheism. They inspire new ways of thinking about reality. Yet beneath these diverse expressions lies a common process: cognition attempting to organize experience at the limits of representation. This perspective neither validates nor invalidates any particular religious doctrine. Instead, it provides a framework for understanding how such doctrines arise from recurring features of human cognition. The significance of mysticism therefore lies not only in what it claims about reality, but in what it reveals about the architecture of the human mind. If there is a final lesson to be drawn from this inquiry, it is one of epistemic humility. The frontier of knowledge is not a wall, but a horizon. Every generation encounters phenomena it cannot fully explain. Every conceptual system eventually reaches its limits. Every map leaves portions of the territory unexplored. Mysticism emerges precisely at this frontier. It marks the point where understanding becomes uncertain, where language becomes symbolic, and where cognition begins constructing new pathways into the unknown. Seen in this light, mysticism is neither the opposite of reason nor its replacement. It is reason encountering its own horizon and continuing forward nonetheless. And perhaps that is why mysticism has persisted throughout human history. It is not merely a collection of beliefs or practices. It is the recurring expression of a fundamental cognitive impulse, the drive to seek meaning beyond the boundaries of what is already known. The edge of knowledge is not a void. It is a zone of formation, and what we call mysticism may simply be the name we give to cognition while new knowledge is still struggling to be born.